Victoria Ashford stood by the massive windows of her penthouse apartment, phone pressed against her ear. Below her, Central Park stretched out like a green carpet, and beyond it, the city hummed with afternoon energy. She was talking numbers, big numbers, the kind that made most people dizzy just thinking about them. "No, tell them 15 million is my final offer," she said firmly into the phone. "If they want more, they can find another investor." At 62 years old, Victoria had built her investment company from absolutely nothing. She started with a small office and a dream, and now she owned one of the most successful firms in Manhattan. People respected her. They feared her a little too. She had this gift, this special ability to look at a struggling business and see exactly what it could become. She could spot potential in failing companies, in new technologies, in risky ventures that others walked away from. But somehow, that gift stopped at her front door. Across the spacious living room, Elena Martinez moved quietly, wiping down the kitchen counters with careful attention. Her hands knew every surface of this apartment. After 15 years of working here, she could clean this place with her eyes closed. The marble countertops, the designer furniture, the art pieces that cost more than her yearly salary. She knew it all. Elena was 45, though some days she felt much older. Working 2 jobs did that to a person. She cleaned Victoria's apartment 3 times a week, and in the evenings, she worked at a hotel downtown. Between both jobs, she barely had time to breathe, but she did it anyway. She had to. She had a son to raise, and she wanted to give him every chance she never had. Today, that son sat near the apartment entrance, perched on one of Victoria's expensive chairs. Daniel was 16, tall and thin, with his mother's dark eyes and his father's quick smile, though right now he wasn't smiling. He was trying to make himself as small as possible, clutching his backpack against his chest like a shield. He had come straight from school to pick up his mom. They had a routine. He would meet her here, they would take the subway home together, and he would do his homework on the train while she rested her tired feet. Simple. Predictable. Safe. Daniel's eyes wandered around the apartment, landing on the piano. It sat in the middle of the living room like a sleeping giant, all black and shiny and beautiful. A Steinway grand piano. He had looked it up once online. This particular model cost about $150,000, more money than his mother made in 3 years. Victoria ended her phone call with a sharp tap of her finger. She let out a long breath and turned around, finally noticing the teenage boy sitting by her door. For a moment she looked confused, as if trying to remember who he was. Then it clicked. "Elena," Victoria called out, not looking away from her laptop screen. "Have your son play something on the piano for me." Elena's hands stopped moving. She looked up, surprised. "Mrs. Ashford?" "The piano," Victoria repeated, gesturing vaguely toward the instrument. "I'm hosting some important people tonight. Donors for that youth music program I sponsor. The piano tuner came this morning, and I want to make sure he actually did his job. Have the boy play a few notes or whatever. Just need to check if it sounds right." Elena dried her hands slowly on her apron. She glanced toward Daniel, who had gone very still in his chair. "Mrs. Ashford, Daniel doesn't really—" "It doesn't need to be anything fancy," Victoria interrupted, still not looking up from her computer. "Just a scale, some basic notes. Anything works. I just need to hear if the sound is off." To Victoria, this was a simple request. Practical, efficient. Why pay someone to come back and test the piano when there was a perfectly capable young person right here? It was the same logic she applied to everything in her life. Use your resources wisely. She didn't mean anything cruel by it. She simply didn't think about it at all. Daniel looked at his mother. Elena's expression was complicated, full of things she couldn't say out loud. She needed this job. They needed this job. So she gave her son a small nod. Slowly, Daniel stood up. His backpack slipped from his lap onto the chair. He walked across the plush carpet toward the piano, each step feeling heavier than the last. Behind him, Victoria had already returned to her work, scrolling through emails and financial reports. To her, the task was already forgotten, just another item checked off her mental list. Daniel reached the piano and stood there for a moment, just looking at it. He had never touched a real piano before. Not like this one. He had played on the old broken keyboard at his school once, keys sticking and half the notes not working. He had played on the ancient piano in the church basement, the one that was so out of tune it sounded like it was crying. But this was something else entirely. He sat down on the bench. The leather was soft, real leather, not the plastic kind. He adjusted his position, remembering everything he had taught himself from videos. Posture matters. Hand position matters. Everything matters when you don't have a teacher to correct you. Daniel placed his fingers on the keys. They felt cool and smooth under his touch. He pressed down gently, testing the weight. The sound that came out was pure, clear, perfect. This piano had been loved and cared for, even if the person who owned it never played it. In the kitchen doorway, Elena held her breath. She knew what was about to happen. She knew her son in ways that Victoria Ashford, with all her business intelligence and sharp instincts, could never imagine. Elena knew about the paper keyboard Daniel had drawn on cardboard when he was 8 years old, the one he practiced on, every night before bed, his fingers moving silently over pencil-drawn keys. She knew about the YouTube videos he watched obsessively, studying the hand movements of great pianists, memorizing their techniques. She knew about the notebook where he wrote out musical notes and compositions, teaching himself to read music the way other kids learn to read books. She knew her son was special. She had always known. Daniel took a breath. Then, instead of playing a simple scale like Victoria had asked, he began to play something real. His fingers found the opening notes of Chopin's Nocturne in E-flat major, one of the most beautiful and challenging pieces in the classical repertoire. The music filled the apartment like water filling a glass, soft at first, then building with emotion and complexity. Daniel's eyes closed halfway as he played, his body moving with the rhythm, his hands dancing across the keys with confidence. That seemed impossible for someone who had never had a single professional lesson. The notes sang out, each one perfectly placed, the melody weaving through the apartment like a living thing. This wasn't a student playing. This wasn't someone just testing keys. This was an artist, young and raw and completely genuine, pouring his heart into music that he had never had the chance to play on an instrument this beautiful. In her study area, Victoria barely looked up. She heard sound, confirmed the piano was working, and went back to her spreadsheets. Another task completed. Time to move on. Daniel's fingers moved across the piano keys like they had been doing this forever. The music flowed from him naturally, each note connecting to the next in a way that made the melody feel alive. He navigated the complex passages of Chopin with the kind of maturity that usually took years of training to develop. His whole body swayed slightly with the emotion of the piece, completely lost in the music. From her desk in the connected study, Victoria heard the sound. But that's all it was to her. Sound, background noise. Pleasant enough, sure, but nothing that required her attention. She had been to Carnegie Hall dozens of times, sitting in expensive seats at concerts that cost hundreds of dollars per ticket, but she went for the networking, for the business connections, for the conversations during intermission with other wealthy investors. The music itself was just something happening while she planned her next deal. So when the beautiful, haunting melody of Chopin filled her penthouse, Victoria simply thought, "Good, the piano works fine." She made a mental checkmark and returned to her laptop screen, scrolling through emails about stock portfolios and merger agreements. But in the kitchen doorway, something completely different was happening. Elena stood frozen, one hand pressed against her mouth, tears streaming down her face. She wasn't crying from sadness. These were tears of pride, of recognition, of a mother finally seeing her child's gift acknowledged in the world, even if the person who should have been paying attention wasn't listening at all. Elena had always known Daniel was special, from the time he was 7 years old and had climbed onto the old piano bench at their neighbor's apartment, pressing keys with wonder in his eyes. She remembered how he had taught himself to play by watching videos on her old, cracked screen phone. Hours and hours of watching, pausing, rewinding, watching again. She remembered finding him at 2 in the morning, headphones on, fingers moving over that paper keyboard he had drawn, practicing silently so he wouldn't wake her. They had never been able to afford lessons. Piano teachers in Manhattan charged $70, $80, sometimes $100 an hour. That was groceries for 2 weeks. That was the electric bill. That was keeping the heat on in winter. So Daniel had learned alone, teaching himself through determination and love for something he couldn't even fully access. Elena had taken him to the church basement once, where Father Miguel kept an old beaten-up piano that nobody used anymore. Half the keys stuck. It was so out of tune that it sounded like it was in pain, but Daniel had played it anyway, and Father Miguel had stood there with tears in his eyes, saying, "This boy has something special. Elena, something really special now." Watching her son play on a piano that cost more than everything they owned combined, Elena understood the cruelty of the situation. Here was her Daniel, pouring his heart into music that he had worked so hard to learn, playing for a woman who literally wasn't even listening, who had asked him to play not because she wanted to hear him, but because she wanted to test her piano the same way someone might test their car engine or check if a light bulb worked. The final notes of the Chopin piece hung in the air for a moment, delicate and beautiful. Then Daniel lifted his hands from the keys. They were trembling slightly. He had never played on an instrument this good before, and it had been overwhelming. The way the keys responded to his touch, the way the sound filled the space, the way every subtle dynamic he tried to create actually worked the way it was supposed to. It was like speaking your whole life through a broken telephone and suddenly being given a microphone that made your voice sound exactly the way you meant it to. "That's fine. Thank you," Victoria called out from her study, her voice casual and dismissive. "Elena, before you leave today, make sure you dust the picture frames in the hallway." "I noticed some dust this morning." Daniel slowly stood from the piano bench. He looked toward his mother, and their eyes met across the apartment. In that moment, without saying a single word, they both understood the same thing. Mrs. Ashford hadn't heard him. Not really. She had heard sound, sure, but she hadn't heard the music. She hadn't heard the years of practice, the late nights, the dedication, the talent, the soul he had just poured into those keys. To Victoria, Daniel had simply performed a household task, like taking out the trash or testing if a light switch worked. Elena quickly wiped her eyes with the back of her hand. She gave Daniel a small nod, trying to smile, trying to tell him without words that she had heard him, that she knew how beautiful it was, that he was seen, even if not by the person who owned the piano. Daniel picked up his backpack from the chair by the door. He glanced once more at the piano, that magnificent instrument that he would probably never touch again. Then he waited quietly for his mother to finish her work so they could go home. But something had happened that neither Daniel nor Elena nor Victoria noticed. The front door of the penthouse had opened. Robert. Chen stood in the entryway, absolutely motionless. He had arrived 15 minutes early for Victoria's donor event, letting himself in with the code she had given to all her close business associates. He had been standing there for the last 3 minutes, hidden from view by the entrance hallway, listening to Daniel play. Robert was 58 years old and had made his fortune in venture capital just like Victoria. But unlike Victoria, Robert actually loved music, not as a networking opportunity or a tax write-off. He genuinely loved it. He served on the board of directors for 3 major symphony orchestras. He attended concerts not for business but because music moved him. He had studied piano himself as a child, though he had never been particularly talented at it. He knew enough to recognize something extraordinary when he heard it, and what he had just heard was extraordinary. Robert had listened to hundreds of pianists over the years, professional concert performers at Lincoln Center, students at Juilliard, international competition winners. He knew the difference between someone who could play the notes correctly and someone who truly understood music. Technical skill was common among serious pianists. But artistry, real genuine artistry, that was rare. Very rare. The kid who had just been playing had both. Robert walked slowly into the living room, his expensive shoes silent on the thick carpet. His mind was racing. That level of musicality didn't come from casual playing. That came from obsession, from dedication, from raw talent combined with serious work. And the kid had mentioned teaching himself, from videos. That was impossible. Except Robert had just heard it with his own ears. Victoria looked up from her computer, surprised to see him. "Robert, you're early." "I wasn't expecting anyone for another hour." Robert barely heard her. He was looking toward the entrance where Daniel and Elena were preparing to leave, the boy's backpack over his shoulder, the woman gathering her cleaning supplies. "Victoria," Robert said slowly, his voice tight with something between amazement and disbelief. "Who is that playing your piano?" Victoria glanced toward Elena and Daniel, then back at Robert. She seemed confused by his intensity. "Oh, that was just Elena's son. I asked him to test the piano for me before tonight's event." "Why?" "Just." That word hung in the air. Robert stared at his longtime friend and business partner. "Just?" he repeated. "Victoria, that young man just played Chopin with interpretation I would expect from a graduate student at a major conservatory." "Who is his teacher?" Now Victoria looked genuinely puzzled. She had never considered the question. "I have no idea. Elena?" Elena had frozen near the door, her cleaning supplies in hand, suddenly aware that something unexpected was happening. "Yes, Mrs. Ashford?" "This is Robert Chen, my business partner. He's asking about Daniel's piano teacher." Elena's throat felt tight. She could feel Daniel's hand slip into hers, the way he used to do when he was small and scared.
"He taught himself, Mrs. Ashford," she said quietly.
"From videos. Online videos. We could never afford lessons." The silence that followed Elena's words felt heavy, like the air itself had weight. Robert stood completely still, staring at the woman and her son near the doorway. His mouth had fallen open slightly, and for a moment he seemed unable to form words. "Taught himself?" Robert finally said. His voice came out strange, almost hoarse. "From online videos?" Elena nodded slowly, unsure what this man wanted from her. She tightened her grip on Daniel's hand. After 15 years of cleaning wealthy people's homes, she had learned to read situations quickly. Something important was happening here, though she didn't fully understand what yet. Robert turned to look at Victoria, and the expression on his face was one Elena had never seen anyone direct at Mrs. Ashford before. It was disappointment, maybe even anger. "Victoria," Robert said carefully, each word measured. "How long has Elena worked for you?" Victoria seemed caught off guard by the question. 15 years. Why does that matter? And in those 15 years, has her son been coming here? To this apartment? "Sometimes," Victoria said, her voice becoming defensive. "When Elena needs to leave directly from here, or when the boy needs to pick her up." "What's this about, Robert?" Robert laughed, but it wasn't a happy sound. It was bitter, almost harsh. "What this is about is that you've had a genuine prodigy walking into your home and you never once actually listened to him. You, Victoria Ashford, who built an entire career on spotting overlooked talent. You never saw what was right in front of you." Victoria's face flushed. She wasn't used to being spoken to this way, especially not by Robert, who had been her friend and business partner for over 20 years. "I think you're being overly dramatic," she said stiffly. "The boy plays nicely, I'm sure, but—" "Nicely?" Robert interrupted. "Victoria, I sit on the board of 3 orchestras. I've heard the best young pianists in the country. What I just heard wasn't nice playing. It was exceptional. It was the kind of talent that comes along maybe once in a generation if you're lucky." Elena felt Daniel's hand trembling in hers. Her son had never been good with attention, especially from adults who weren't his teachers or people he knew well. He was shy, uncomfortable in situations like this. But Elena could also feel something else in his trembling. Hope. Terrifying, dangerous hope. "I don't understand what you want me to say," Victoria said, her voice tight. Robert pulled out his phone. "I want you to actually listen for once instead of just hearing background noise." He walked toward Daniel and Elena, his expression softening. "Son, what's your name?" "Daniel," the boy said quietly. "Daniel Martinez." "Daniel, I know this is strange and I'm sorry for putting you on the spot, but would you be willing to play something else? Just one more piece? I promise I have a good reason for asking." Daniel looked up at his mother. Elena's mind was racing. They had already missed their usual bus. She had to be at her evening job at the hotel in 2 hours, and she still needed to go home, change clothes, and somehow find something for Daniel to eat for dinner. But she looked at her son's face and saw that flicker of hope again. When did he ever get chances like this? When did anyone ever ask him to play who might actually understand what they were hearing? Okay, Elena said softly. One more song. Daniel walked back to the piano. This time his steps were different. Not nervous or reluctant, but purposeful. He sat down on the bench, adjusted his position, and took a deep breath. Then he began to play Rachmaninoff's Prelude in C-sharp minor. The opening chords crashed through the apartment like thunder. This wasn't the gentle, flowing beauty of Chopin. This was power, drama, intensity. Daniel's fingers attacked the keys with controlled force, bringing out the dark, almost ominous quality of the piece. Then, just as quickly, the music shifted. The middle section bloomed with tender, lyrical beauty, his touch softening to create sounds so delicate they seemed like whispers. Victoria had been about to return to her laptop, but something made her stop. Maybe it was the sheer volume of the opening chords. Maybe it was the look on Robert's face, or maybe for the first time, she actually allowed herself to pay attention. She walked slowly into the living room and stood behind the couch, watching Daniel play. Really watching. She saw how his whole body engaged with the music, how his face showed every emotion the piece demanded, how his fingers moved with the kind of precision and artistry that couldn't be faked or learned from a simple tutorial video. This wasn't someone playing notes on a page. This was someone speaking a language he understood in his bones. The piece built to its dramatic conclusion, Daniel's hands flying across the keyboard, pulling out the full, rich sound of the Steinway in a way that made the entire apartment seem to vibrate with music. Then with a final decisive chord, it was over. The silence that followed felt different from before, heavier with meaning. Robert was already typing frantically on his phone. "I'm calling Gregory Silverman at Juilliard right now," he said, his words tumbling out quickly. "Daniel needs to audition. He needs a proper teacher, a real piano to practice on daily, and wait," Elena said. The word came out sharper than she intended. "Please wait." Robert looked up from his phone, surprised. Elena's voice was steady, but there was steel underneath it. Steel forged from years of working 2 jobs, of raising a son alone, of making impossible choices between food and medicine, between heat and electricity. "We cannot afford these things you are talking about. Juilliard is for rich families. Teachers like that cost more money than I make in a month, maybe in a year. You won't need to pay," Robert said quickly. "I'll personally set up a fund for Daniel's education. I'll cover the costs of—" "Why?" Elena interrupted. The question hung in the air, simple but loaded with complexity. "Why would you do this for us? You don't know us. You heard my son play for 5 minutes." Robert opened his mouth, then closed it. He seemed to struggle with how to answer. Finally, he said, "Because talent like this shouldn't be wasted. Because it would be a crime to let someone with Daniel's gift go unrecognized. Because—" He paused, looking uncomfortable. "Because I had a brother who could paint. Really paint. He was brilliant. But we were poor. And my parents couldn't afford art school, and he ended up working in a factory his whole life. He died at 47, never having shown his work to anyone but family. I swore if I ever had the means, I wouldn't let that happen to someone else if I could prevent it." The room fell silent again. Elena felt tears building behind her eyes, but she refused to let them fall. Not yet. Not in front of these people. Victoria had been standing very still during this entire exchange, and the expression on her face was complicated. Shame was there, definitely, but also something else, a kind of dawning awareness, like someone waking up from a long sleep. "Robert," Victoria said quietly, "you said I should be making this offer." Robert turned to look at her, his expression hard to read. "Yes, I did say that." Victoria walked closer to Elena and Daniel. For the first time in the 15 years Elena had worked for her, Victoria looked directly at her, really looked at her, as if seeing an actual person instead of someone who dusted her furniture. "You're right," Victoria said. Her voice was softer than usual, stripped of its normal commanding tone. "You're absolutely right." More guests were starting to arrive. Elena could hear voices in the hallway, people greeting each other, the sounds of Victoria's wealthy friends gathering for their donor event. People who would write checks for music programs they would never personally interact with. People like Victoria had been an hour ago. Victoria raised her hand slightly, a gesture that somehow commanded attention despite its smallness. "Before we go any further, I need to say something." She looked at Daniel. "Would you be willing to play for my guests tonight? Not to test the piano, not as a favor to me, but as the featured performer. I want them to hear what real talent sounds like, what real music sounds like, and I want to listen. Really listen this time." Daniel looked uncertain, his eyes darting between his mother and this woman who had barely acknowledged his existence minutes ago. Elena squeezed his shoulder gently, leaving the choice to him. "Okay," Daniel said softly. "I'll play." The penthouse filled with people quickly. They arrived in groups of 2 and 3, all dressed in expensive clothes that probably cost more than Elena's monthly rent. The women wore jewelry that caught the light, and the men had watches that gleamed on their wrists. They air-kissed each other's cheeks and talked in voices that carried confidence born from never having to worry about money. Elena stood off to the side with Daniel, feeling suddenly very aware of her cleaning uniform and her son's worn sneakers. She wanted to leave. Every instinct told her to grab Daniel's hand, collect her things, and walk out the door. These weren't their people. This wasn't their world. They didn't belong here. But Daniel had agreed to play, and Elena had taught her son that when you give your word, you keep it, even when it's uncomfortable, even when you're scared. Victoria moved through her guests with practiced ease, shaking hands and greeting people by name. But Elena noticed something different about her tonight. Victoria kept glancing toward the piano, toward Daniel, with an expression that was hard to read. Was it guilt? Curiosity? Maybe both. Robert stayed close to Elena and Daniel as if worried they might disappear. He made small talk, trying to put them at ease, asking Daniel about school and what other pieces he liked to play. Daniel answered quietly, still overwhelmed by everything happening. After about 20 minutes, Victoria moved to the center of the room and raised her voice slightly. The conversations died down. Everyone turned to face her, champagne glasses in hand, ready for the speech they had come to hear about youth music programs and charitable donations. "Thank you all for coming tonight," Victoria began. Her voice had that smooth professional quality she used at business meetings. "I invited you here to discuss the importance of supporting young musical talent in our city. I've spent years funding programs, writing checks, attending fundraisers." She paused, and something shifted in her expression. "But tonight I realized something. I've been funding the idea of helping talented young people without actually seeing the talented young people right in front of me." The room grew quieter. This wasn't the speech anyone had expected. "For 15 years, Victoria continued, her voice quieter now, "Elena Martinez has worked in my home. She's been reliable, trustworthy, and invisible. That last part is my fault, not hers. I made her invisible by choosing not to see her as a complete person, not to see her son as anything more than a presence in my doorway." Victoria's hands gripped the back of a chair. "Today I asked Daniel to test my piano, like asking someone to test a doorbell or check if a faucet works. I didn't ask him to play. I asked him to perform a task." Elena felt her breath catch. She hadn't expected this. Hadn't expected Victoria Ashford to stand in front of her wealthy friends and admit any kind of failure. "But Daniel didn't just test the keys," Victoria said. "He played Chopin. Beautifully. With more artistry than I've heard from performers I've paid hundreds of dollars to see. And I didn't notice. I didn't listen. My colleague Robert had to arrive early and actually pay attention to what was happening in my own home." Robert stood with his arms crossed, watching Victoria carefully. The guests looked confused, unsure where this was going. Some of them glanced around, trying to figure out who Elena and Daniel were. "I built my career on spotting potential," Victoria said, and now there was real emotion in her voice, "on finding value that others overlooked. But I stopped looking in my own life. I stopped seeing the people around me as anything more than their function. Elena cleans. Daniel tests pianos. That's all I allowed them to be." She turned to face Daniel directly. "I was wrong. Completely wrong. And I'm sorry." The room was absolutely silent now. Elena felt tears threatening again, but she blinked them back. She wouldn't cry, not here, not now. "Tonight," Victoria said, "I'm not going to tell you about programs that need funding or statistics about underprivileged youth. Tonight, I'm going to ask you to listen, really listen. Daniel Martinez is going to play for us, not because I asked him to test my piano, but because he deserves to be heard." Victoria gestured toward the piano. Daniel looked at his mother one more time. Elena nodded, squeezed his shoulder, and whispered, "Show them who you are, mijo." Daniel walked to the piano. Every eye in the room followed him. He could feel their curiosity, their judgment, their doubt. A cleaning woman's son in old jeans and a school t-shirt, about to play for people who probably attended the opera and symphony regularly. People who knew what good music sounded like. People who had opinions about things he had only ever experienced through his phone screen. He sat down on the bench and placed his hands on the keys. For a moment, he just sat there breathing. Then he began to play. He chose Gershwin's Rhapsody in Blue. It was a risk. The piece jumped between classical precision and jazz improvisation, between structure and freedom. It required not just technical skill, but genuine feeling, an understanding of both worlds the music came from. But Daniel loved this piece. He had watched Leonard Bernstein's performance of it at least 100 times, studying every nuance, every choice, every moment where the music became something more than notes on a page. His fingers found the opening clarinet glissando translated to piano, that long sliding note that announced something special was about to happen. Then he dove into the main theme, his hands dancing across the keys, moving between the classical and jazz elements with natural ease. His body swayed with the rhythm, completely absorbed in the music. The guests stood frozen, champagne glasses forgotten. This wasn't what they had expected. This wasn't some kid fumbling through a piece he had barely learned. This was a musician, young and raw, but completely authentic. He played with passion and precision, with technique and soul. Victoria watched from the side of the room, and for the first time in longer than she could remember, she felt something break open inside her chest. Shame, yes, but also wonder, also recognition. This was what talent looked like when you actually bothered to see it. This was what happened when you looked at people instead of through them. Robert stood next to her, arms still crossed, but his expression had softened slightly. He leaned close and whispered, "This is what you almost missed forever." Victoria nodded, unable to speak. Daniel moved through the piece with growing confidence. The Steinway responded to every subtle shift in his touch, every dynamic change, every emotional color he wanted to create. He had never had an instrument that could actually do what he asked of it. Playing this piano was like speaking a language fluently for the first time after years of struggling with broken words. The piece built to its jazzy, triumphant conclusion, Daniel's fingers flying across the keyboard in the final exuberant passages. Then with one last decisive chord it ended. For a moment nothing happened. The room held its breath. Then someone started clapping. Then someone else. Then everyone was applauding, and it wasn't the polite, obligatory applause people gave at charity events. It was real, enthusiastic. Some people were actually cheering. Daniel stood from the piano, his face flushed, his hands shaking slightly. He looked toward his mother. Elena had tears streaming down her face now, no longer trying to hide them. She was clapping too, harder than anyone else, her face split with a smile that could have lit up the entire city. Victoria walked forward as the applause continued. She stopped in front of Daniel and did something she had never done before. She looked at him, really looked at him, not as her maid's son, not as someone performing a task, but as a person, as an artist, as someone with a gift that deserved recognition. "That was extraordinary," Victoria said quietly, just for Daniel to hear beneath the applause. "Thank you for sharing it with us." "With me?" Daniel nodded, still too overwhelmed to speak much. "Thank you for the piano, Mrs. Ashford. It's the most beautiful instrument I've ever played." The simplicity of his gratitude hit Victoria harder than any accusation could have. He was thanking her for something she had given him by accident, something she had never intended for him to have. The applause finally died down, but the energy in the room hadn't settled. Victoria's guests clustered around Daniel asking questions, pulling out their phones to exchange contact information with Elena. A woman who owned an art gallery said she wanted Daniel to perform at her next exhibition opening. A man who ran a tech company asked if Daniel had ever considered recording his playing for streaming platforms. Elena stood in the center of it all, feeling dizzy. This was too much, too fast. These people with their business cards and their offers and their sudden interest in her son. Where had they been yesterday? Where had they been all the years Daniel had been teaching himself on a paper keyboard? Robert gently extracted Daniel from the crowd and guided him and Elena toward a quieter corner of the penthouse. "I know this is overwhelming," he said, his voice calm and steady. "But I meant what I said earlier. I've already contacted Gregory Silverman at Juilliard. He's the head of the piano department. He wants to hear Daniel audition this Saturday." Elena's stomach dropped. "This Saturday? That's 2 days away." "I know it's fast," Robert said, "but Gregory is leaving for Europe next week for a concert tour." If we wait, it'll be months before he's back. And Daniel is ready. You heard him play. Ready? Elena's voice came out sharper than she intended. Mr. Chen, I appreciate what you're trying to do, but Daniel has never auditioned for anything. He's never even had a real lesson. You're talking about Juilliard. That's where the best musicians in the world study, children who have been training since they were 3 years old with expensive teachers and Daniel taught himself. Robert interrupted gently, which makes what he can do even more remarkable. Elena, I've been around music my whole life. I know what I heard tonight. Your son has something that can't be taught. Yes, he needs training. Yes, he needs guidance. But the core of what makes him special, that's already there. Daniel had been quiet during this exchange, but now he spoke up. Mom, I want to try. Even if I don't get in, I want to try. Elena looked at her son, really looked at him. He was 16, still so young, but there was something in his eyes that reminded her he wouldn't be young forever. How many times had she worked double shifts so he could have opportunities? How many times had she sacrificed so he could have chances she never had? And now, when a real opportunity was right in front of them, was she going to be the one to say no? Okay, Elena said quietly. Okay, we'll try. Victoria had been standing a few feet away, not quite part of the conversation, but close enough to hear everything. Now she stepped forward. I'd like to make a formal offer, she said. Her voice had that business-like quality again, but underneath it was something softer. Daniel, I would like to fund your education. Completely. Juilliard's tuition, a private teacher, whatever you need. Not as charity. As an investment, Elena stiffened. An investment in what, Mrs. Ashford? In someone I should have noticed a long time ago, Victoria said. She met Elena's eyes directly. I can't undo my blindness. I can't go back and listen to all the times Daniel probably played within my hearing, and I dismissed it as background noise. But I can do something now. Why now? Elena's voice was steady, but there was steel underneath it. Because Mr. Chen recognized my son's talent? Because your guests clapped? Or because you finally see Daniel as more than just someone who tests your piano? The question hung in the air between them, sharp and necessary. The other guests had gone quiet again, sensing the tension. Robert took a small step back, letting this moment belong to the two women. Victoria was silent for a long moment. When she finally spoke, her voice was raw in a way Elena had never heard before. All of those reasons, she admitted. And I'm ashamed that I needed someone else to point out what should have been obvious to me. I built my entire career on seeing potential that others missed. But I stopped looking at people in my own life. You've worked for me for 15 years, Elena. 15 years. And I couldn't tell you your son's favorite subject in school. I couldn't tell you what makes him laugh. I couldn't tell you anything about him except that he sometimes sits by my door waiting for you. Her voice cracked slightly. That doesn't speak well of me. Elena felt something shift in her chest. This wasn't the Victoria Ashford she had worked for all these years. This was someone struggling with an uncomfortable truth about themselves. And Elena knew how hard that was. She had struggled with her own truths plenty of times. No, Elena said quietly. It doesn't speak well of you. But at least you're admitting it now instead of making excuses. Victoria nodded, accepting the criticism. I'm offering to help because I want to. Because I can. And because letting someone with Daniel's talent go unsupported would be another failure I couldn't live with. But I understand if you don't trust this offer. I understand if you'd rather accept help from Robert or find another way forward. I've done nothing to earn your trust. Daniel's hand found his mother's. Mom, he said softly. Maybe people can change. Maybe Mrs. Ashford is trying to change. Elena looked at her son. This boy who had taught himself to make beauty from nothing, who had patience and forgiveness that she sometimes struggled to find. Then she looked at Victoria, standing there with her wealth and her guilt and her late-blooming awareness. I need to hear you say something, Elena said to Victoria, and I need you to mean it. Anything, Victoria said, say that you see my son. Not as a project. Not as a way to make yourself feel better, but as a real person with his own dreams and his own voice. Victoria looked at Daniel, really looked at him, the way she should have been looking at him for years. I see you, Daniel, she said, and her voice shook slightly. I see someone with extraordinary talent and dedication, someone who worked harder than I probably ever have. Learning something difficult with no help, no resources, no encouragement from people who should have been paying attention. I see someone who deserves every opportunity that should have been offered years ago. She paused, and I'm sorry it took me this long to open my eyes. Daniel smiled, small but genuine. Thank you, Mrs. Ashford. The guests began to disperse after that, though several left their contact information with Elena, genuine offers of help and support. Robert confirmed the audition details with Daniel, promised to pick them up Saturday morning, and gave Elena his personal cell phone number. Call me if you need anything, he said. And I mean anything. Questions about Juilliard, help preparing for the audition, whatever you need. As people filtered out, Victoria walked over to the piano. She ran her hand along its polished surface. This instrument she had bought years ago more as a status symbol than anything else. It had sat here, largely ignored, waiting for someone who would actually understand its voice. And that person had been coming to her home for years, invisible. Elena finished packing up her cleaning supplies. She was already late for her evening shift at the hotel, but somehow that seemed less important now. Daniel stood beside her, still looking a bit dazed by everything that had happened. Elena, Victoria called out, you don't need to come in next week for your regular cleaning days. Take the time to help Daniel prepare for his audition. Mrs. Ashford, I need this job, Elena said carefully. You'll still be paid, Victoria said quickly. Consider it paid time off. And actually, she paused, seeming to struggle with something. Would you and Daniel like to come for dinner next week? Not for work, just to talk. I'd like to hear about Daniel's music. About what pieces he loves and why. About what he dreams of doing. She looked embarrassed. I'd like to learn who he actually is. Elena studied Victoria's face, looking for insincerity and finding only honest hope. Okay, she said finally. We can do that. 2 months later, Daniel stood on the stage at Juilliard's recital hall, preparing for his acceptance performance. The audition had gone better than anyone expected. Gregory Silverman had called him a once-in-a-decade talent and offered him a full scholarship on the spot. In the audience, Elena sat in the third row, wearing a new dress that Victoria had insisted on buying her. You're not staff tonight, Victoria had said. You're the mother of the performer. You should look the part. Next to Elena sat Victoria, and next to her, Robert. The three of them had become an unlikely team over the past weeks, working together to support Daniel through the whirlwind of auditions, paperwork, and preparation. As Daniel began to play, his fingers confident on the piano, Victoria reached over and gently squeezed Elena's hand. Elena squeezed back. It wasn't forgiveness, not entirely, but it was a beginning. A recognition that people could change, could learn to see what had been invisible before. And sometimes, if you were very lucky, they could learn before it was too late.